Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Henna Zuberi. Over the past 9 years, war has ravaged Syria and its people. The Syrian civil war is ongoing and multi-sided. It's fought between the Ba'athist Syrian Arab Republic led by the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, along with domestic and foreign allies, and various domestic and foreign forces opposing both the Syrian government and each other in varying combinations. Recently, Syrian President Bashar Assad fired his Prime Minister Imad Khamis as the country continues to struggle with an economic crisis, mainly around collapsing currency and damaging economic sanctions. Protests have recently erupted against Assad's rule, beginning in the city of Suwaida. Demonstrators have are asking and protesting against falling living standards and corruption. So while all of this is taking place, a lot of us who are watching from really, really far away, especially here in the United States, Canada, Mexico, we wanted to let our audience on Muslim Network TV, as well as Justice for All Now, really take a deeper look at the Syrian crisis, what is happening to the people, really highlight the narratives of people who are affected by this directly. So joining us today to have this discussion is Razan Zafour. Razan Zafour is a British Syrian researcher currently residing in Istanbul. She works in consulting with Syrian NGOs and civil society organizations. She's an active journalist, has written op-eds, and does advocacy. Razan has a master's in history. So Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Razan, for being here with us today. And I look forward to this conversation.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Hannah, for having me.
Alhamdulillah. So tell me a little bit more about yourself, your background, and the work you do.
Okay, so starting off, I'm not a journalist in any way, shape, or form. I have written
opinion pieces, so I figured...
Yeah, so I have written opinion pieces because I always think it's important for people to hear the voices of those who are active on ground.
Okay.
I think it's important for people to hear the voices of Syrians and not have people speak over Syrians, as is very often the case, especially in places like the UK, in places like the US, when you have think tanks, when you have people who happen to be more ideologically inclined, but not necessarily aware of what's happening on ground. So that's what I have to say about the journalism part. Otherwise, I've been working on the Syrian conflict since its inception. In fact, since before it started. My parents have a background in political activism. My father started up the first Syrian Human Rights Committee in the late 80s and the early 90s, exposing the crimes of the Assad regime. And I think for as far as I can remember, as early as I can remember, I've been helping my father in filing, in hearing the stories, in learning how to translate from Arabic to English the testimonies of former detainees, the testimonies of asylum seekers, people who have been, prior to 2011, subject to aggression from the Assad regime. Or by the Assad regime, and attempting to flee the country in order to be able to live a free life, essentially. So I've been working on that from a young age, and then naturally starting from 2011, when the revolution erupted, I entered the world of activism with much more vigor, and I began working. I've shifted from a number of jobs. Initially, most Syrians started off working in the humanitarian sector and in the advocacy sector. So we would go around, we would try to raise awareness, we would go to parliament. So I'm British, so I would go to parliament with my fellow British Syrian activists. We would try to convince certain MPs to take certain stances. When it came to Syria, we were both successful and unsuccessful in certain in certain means, in certain situations. That shifted to more humanitarian as more charities began starting up. I would work with very specifically Syrian charities, as they always have had more and deeper reach inside Syria. And then I shifted back to the political scene, traveling to Istanbul, working with a number of organizations, both between transitional justice, and trying to ensure that we work towards transitional justice in Syria. And lately, my last job has been in consulting Syrian health organizations, in communications and advocacy, working closely with the WHO, with UN agencies, attempting to ensure that they have good response teams when it comes to northwestern Syria, which is the last area in Syria which is currently not under the government control, regime control.
This has been a personal struggle for you too. And so what have you learned in your work since you started? Like, how has your work changed as the crisis on the ground is changing? So that's like a personal question that I wanted to ask you. And then I wanted to also ask you that since the revolution started in 2011, I really want to take educate some of our listeners, some people who might have never, they might have heard about Syria, but they might never know what was actually going on beyond the headlines they might have read. So let's talk a little bit first about how your work has changed as the situation on the ground has changed. And then I want you to share with us who are the main parties involved internally and internationally.
Okay, so the first question is a bit difficult to charter, because I think, as you said, the Syrian struggle has been both personal as much as it is international. For me personally, I feel like I've learned and I've grown as the Syrian struggle has grown itself. So initially, just as the people were going out on the streets, just as people were going out and demanding for freedom and justice, for an end to the regime, for a fall to the regime, me and my activist friends and my family, we were mirroring that in our respective countries. We were going around, we had stalls outside in Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Street, in like the centres in London and Manchester and Birmingham. We would go around, we'd hand out leaflets, we would do flash mobs, we'd do protests, we'd try to educate the people about what's happening. We would mirror those demands. As the revolution got bloodier, as the Assad regime began opening fire on the protesters, began massacring entire towns and villages, our work still, to a certain extent, was still raising awareness, but then to another extent took on a more humanitarian stance, where we were trying to desperately raise money in order to help those, in order to set up makeshift hospitals in non-regime held areas, in order to ensure that the people inside Syria who needed the money, the people who were being besieged, the people who were being attacked, were getting the reinforcements necessary from those of us, those Syrians who were outside, who were attempting to help. I think come 2016, with the fall of Aleppo, when the regime, alongside their allies, the Iranians and the Russians, besieged the entirety of Aleppo. And it was very important for them to take over Aleppo, because Aleppo has always been an important center of commerce for the Syrian regime. When they took over, when they regained Aleppo in a very, very bloody way, much of our activism turned to survival. So previously we were speaking about transitional justice, previously we were speaking about freedom, we were speaking about democracy, we were speaking about just being able to live regime free without having a dictatorship, without having an authoritarian regime ruling over us. And then it turned to complete survival, where the narrative had shifted, where a lot of people, especially a lot of journalists, a lot of media agencies, a lot of think tanks, a lot of people who were on the outside, not realizing how much of an effect they had on actually affecting the narrative, speaking or assuming or saying that the regime had won, had won the war, so to speak, those of us who were on the outside still working closely with the activists on the inside and with the people on the inside who were being devastated, we turned into survival tactics. How do I say this? Essentially, the tables were turned, and we found ourselves desperately rallying to ensure that people were still aware that we were there, that we were alive, that we had a message, and that the regime hadn't won, because you don't win over a revolution in a brutal manner like that. And we were trying to raise awareness about the deaths now, about the massacres, about not just the deaths and the massacres, but the entire devastation of the Syrian infrastructure, which the regime and their allies had destroyed, essentially. We were essentially fighting with our voices. And I think that's continued to now, with a lot of people sort of, I don't want to say not caring, because that would be very unfair on the people on the rest of the world, given what's going on now, and given like the plethora of humanitarian crises across the world. But people began not focusing so much in Syria. People bought into that regime narrative, and so much of our work now has been ensuring that this is still happening. The regime still needs to go. The regime now is more fierce than ever. They're just fighting in different ways, and people need to be aware of this. I can't hear him.
Yeah. You're so right that can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. That the focus does shift, and there's new crises that keep coming up, and people start talking about that, and then the lens shifts, and then something else happens, and the lens shifts, and there's so many crises across the globe, and even, you know, and especially with the pandemic, and we'll be talking much more in detail about how COVID has affected Syria, and you know, under this regime. So let's talk about where, you know, what I want to really learn from you is where, you know, since 2011 to now, where is Syria now as a nation? What is happening on the ground? Like, who, you know, so, a lot of times we're shown images, and then like the people behind those images, like you see aerial shots of Aleppo, but where are all the people where are they now? And so, and then in the regime held areas, what is life like for people over there?
Okay. So it would be completely wrong for me to represent the entirety of Syrians, of course. I can only represent myself. That said, so from the beginning up until now, we've had an estimate of 1 million dead. We've had over 90% of which have been killed by the regime and their allies. We have had more than half of the population displaced, both internally and externally. In Turkey alone, as I currently reside in Istanbul, in Turkey alone, we have about 5,000 Syrian refugees. In Idlib, which is inside Syria, you have approximately 3,000 internally displaced Syrians. So that's Syrians who don't belong in Idlib, or perhaps I shouldn't phrase it that way, but Syrians who aren't from Idlib, but because every single time the regime would take over a place, they would send all the dissenting Syrians up to Idlib. And since the 1st of December 2019, we've seen an escalation of violence, essentially by the regime and by their allies, particularly by Russia, attempting to retake and regain Idlib so as to complete to complete them retaking and regaining the entirety of Syria. That within itself has seen unprecedented violence. We've seen at least 1 million Syrians flee to the Turkish-Syrian border. So right now, currently, as we speak, there are over 1 million Syrians who are on the Turkish-Syrian border, some of which don't even have shelter, or their shelter is very scarce. They live in tents. At one point last year in the summer, when the escalation was just about starting before it took on a proper turn, there were Syrians who had no shelter, and they were essentially seeking refuge under trees, under olive trees. So we're speaking about that. We're speaking about Idlib, and we're speaking about refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, and Turkey, all which have their own set of issues. Arguably in Lebanon, they face a lot of discrimination, they face a lot of racism, they aren't allowed to work, they aren't allowed to own property, they're not allowed to access certain places, they're not allowed to access certain healthcare, they're not allowed to access healthcare, essentially. In Jordan, they have it slightly better, particularly those who are residing within the cities, they live relatively well, whereas those who live in refugee camps on the Jordan and Syrian border also have it extremely, extremely bad. In Rukban, for instance, no one has claimed the Rukban camp. The Jordanians don't want to take responsibility. The Syrian regime want to take responsibility, but only under their rules, and the residents of Rukban don't want that at all. And so they're also subjected to aggressions and microaggressions constantly by the Syrian regime. And they haven't had access to the UN facilities and the UN nutrition baskets, essentially, which the UN is supposed to be able to send to the Rukban camp, but have been stopped time and time again by the Syrian regime. And then you have the Syrians who live under regime control. It's difficult to speak about how they live because it's very different depending on who you are, depending from which camp you're from, depending on where you're living. So there are areas which the regime have regained control but haven't rebuilt, haven't even attempted to help rebuild the infrastructure or help repair the infrastructure. So a lot of the Syrians are living still in completely broken houses, destroyed houses. There's no healthcare access there. There isn't much sanitation. They're living, as they're essentially fending for themselves. But at the same time, there happens to be some sort of regime control. So if they do go out and protest, if they do oppose the regime in any way, they will be taken. And there are those who are living in areas such as Damascus, where it's still relatively peaceful there, since the regime ensured to look after the capital city, or people who are living in Sweida, people living in Latakia. I wouldn't be able to speak on how they're living. I think it differs, again, from class, from family to family. Some people are living relatively well off, others aren't living at all well off, especially with the recent devastation of the Syrian economy. You have stories of people who can't even buy bread in regime-held areas, since bread now is almost 800 Syrian liras. 800 Syrian liras is an incredible amount. I'm sure you know now 3,000 Syrian liras equates $1 American dollar. So yeah.
No, thank you. And I know it's a difficult question, and it's such a vast question, but people have to realize that there are separate groups of people, and they're all affected differently, and it's. There's a lot of layers to it. There's a lot of, and then things change on a consistent basis as well, from time to, depending on what area you're in. And so unless you're following the news every day, and really are involved in the struggle or involved in following the revolution, a lot of people, it all becomes like this, just stats, right? It just becomes like numbers, and people forget that these are 1 million people.
If I may add, I think people also forget the demographics. We're speaking about the elderly, we're speaking about the disabled, we're speaking about people who are immunocompromised, we're speaking about pregnant women, we're speaking about children, we're speaking about the injured. Often we forget, and we sort of like think that those who are living are similar to us, because we are always it's always easier to relate to ourselves. In my last job, a lot of the times we would be working with elderly people who had never left their village, let alone the entire country, and are suddenly now stranded on a border, and they have no idea what to do with themselves. People who are 70, 80, 90. And then when you think about it, when you think about the lack of shelter, the lack of sanitation, the lack of hygiene. So in the NGO world, we call this WASH, water, sanitation, hygiene, and recently it's been also encompassing of protection and nutrition. When you think about these people, I mean, think about how, sorry to be a bit crude here, but think about how you would go and relieve yourself. How you would go to the bathroom or to the toilet. These are elderly people. Think about how your grandma or your elderly father or someone who's elderly in your family and how much difficulty they have with the right facilities. Now imagine someone who's living in a tent and sharing this tent with their entire family, and then sharing the hygiene facilities with an entire campsite of several hundred people, several thousand people, sometimes in certain instances. It's not at all an easy thing to live with, essentially. And I think not just the brutality, like the brutality of the Assad regime and of this war hasn't just affected Syrians through bullets and through carpet bombing and through the military offensive, essentially, but it's also affected them in their daily life. It's also affected them in the lack of hygiene, the lack of sanitation, in the malnutrition, in the lack of food, and the lack of just basic needs and services.
So, and then even within Syria, within where the regime is, right, where they're in control, the poverty rates are astronomical. It's said that 80% of Syrians are said to be living in poverty, while the government's GDP has decreased about 75% since the initial, war began. A lot of times, we hear, this man, Assad, has won against his opponents. And this is this narrative that is pushed many places, sort of like, okay, he's won, move on, let's, that sort of thing. What do you have to say to that?
So I think it's very important for us to understand narratives over here, and the narratives at play, essentially. And the narratives are always at play when it comes to war. Assad's opponents, I think the Assad regime have been successful, so to speak, in ensuring that people think that he's fighting a war against terrorists, that he's fighting a war against armed militias, against people who have rallied against him alongside al-Qaeda. This is not true. If we just look back at how the revolution started, it started off as peaceful protests. It started off as people going out in masses on the streets, demanding freedom, demanding the fall of the regime, demanding just a dignified life, away from dictatorship, away from authoritarianism. Later, of course, the revolution became armed, as most revolutions do. And even when you chart the progress of the militarization, essentially, of the revolution, it started off as people defecting from the Assad regime, of just Syrian men who felt like it was immoral and unethical of them to shoot at their brothers and sisters. People who really felt devastated deep down, they ended up defecting, and they ended up forming the Free Syrian Army. We're speaking 2011, 2012, 2013 here. They began forming cohorts of the Free Syrian Army in protecting, in defense, not necessarily in offense. Later, as the violence and the barbarity of the Syrian regime escalated, the militarized groups, later turning into rebel groups, also ended up upping their strategies. And then eventually, around 2013, 2014, we had the input of external factors. We had certain countries such as Saudi, such as Qatar, certain Gulf countries. We had the US arming certain cohorts of the Kurdish resistance. And this ended up really harming our revolution on one hand, whilst at the same time allowing other resistance and other rebel groups on the other hand to advance and to ensure the safety of certain areas away from the Assad regime. It's very difficult to speak about this because it's not black and white. It's not these people are good, these people are bad. That's not the case at all. In fact, certain external elements, certain people have funded groups or have imported groups, so to speak, have actually harmed our revolution a lot with extremist ideologies, both Islamic ideologies and Marxist extremist ideologies. They've harmed us a lot and they've harmed our progress a lot. But it's very important to keep in mind that this wasn't the essence, and till now it's not the essence. When we look at the protests today in Suwaida, the peaceful protests that are going out, which started a few days ago, in fact I think a week ago, people went out and they demanded and they chanted the same demands that the very first protest chanted, which is for freedom, and for the fall of the Assad regime.
And what are the demands of these protesters in Sweida? They're under. Where is Sweida? Clarify that for us.
Sweida is actually right in the middle of the regime stronghold. It's Nella Takia. It's right in the middle of the regime stronghold, and most of the demographics happen to be Druze. So, in fact, Suwaida started off with a few protests at the beginning of the revolution. Ever since then, the regime ensured that their influence in the power was very entrenched, that they didn't go out so much. So for them to go out now has actually been a surprise to many Syrian activists and to much of Syria itself. People didn't expect Suwaida to go out in such way. The regime has attempted to shift the narrative, and they've attempted to say, oh, the protesters are protesting against the EU and US sanctions after the devastation of the Syrian lira. But if you actually listen to what they're saying, if you look at what they're holding up the Syrian Revolution flag. The chants that they're saying are not anti-EU or anti-US. In fact, they don't even bring in any external factors. Literally, all they're saying is, we want the fall of the regime. They're cursing the soul of Hafiz, who is Bashar al-Assad's father, and they're even sending mercy upon the soul of Sarut, who was a revolution icon who was killed last year in Eid by the regime.
So what are you, in your opinion, what is pushing them out to the streets? Like, I understand it's surprise activists, but is it the economic situation over there, or do you think that these are people who get it and are just tired of the beast?
I think an amalgamation of all of them. I think most of these people got it from the very beginning, and have always wanted to go out. They did actually go out. It would be unjust of me to say that they didn't go out. They did go out, but the regime was very successful in entrenching their boots there and scaring people. Because as we know, the protests at the beginning and up until now, whenever people would go out and protest against the Assad regime, it would be met with live fire, with bullets, with massacres, or with people being detained. I do think that it's been an amalgamation of people being tired, but also definitely the economic factor definitely plays a big role here. People are completely tired of the Assad regime. They're tired of how the Assad regime have time and time again neglected the Syrian people and essentially pushed all of their funding and all of their money into the military aspect, into ensuring that they are killing Syrians in their attempt to regain Syria. But they haven't actually cared for the civilians themselves. And people are completely tired of that. You can't claim to be a protector of the country, you can't claim to be the protector of the Watan if you're not actually protecting the Syrians themselves. If Syrians are, as you said, 80% of them are under the poverty line.
And some of the things that we're also hearing is there are references being made to war crimes. There are being references made to the rape of women and the way minorities are being treated, and the torture chamber. All of that has occurred in the past 9 years. Is this something that is also it's sparking some of these people into way that come out?
I'm sure it is. I mean, anyone living in Syria is aware of the brutality of the Assad regime. Even those who support him are aware of the brutality of the Assad regime. Those who don't support him but have kept silence, there's a reason why they're silent. And the brutality of the Assad regime isn't a secret. And when we speak about brutality, I mean, Perhaps it's something that I should disclaim at the beginning, because one assumes that people know of this, because we have been living this, and we haven't just been living it, as I mentioned at the beginning, since 2011. It hasn't been just ongoing for the past 9 years. It's been ongoing for the past 40, 50 years since the Assad regime came into power in Syria. The torture of detainees has always been part of the state infrastructure. The rape of women, particularly those who have been detained or those who come from opposition families, has always been a case. In fact, I worked on a report just a year and a half ago, where, was it a year and a half ago? It was less than a year and a half ago. I think it was just a year ago, where I interviewed women who have been raped by the Assad regime in prisons. It was one of those things where you hear a lot, you read about it a lot, particularly as an activist. You've met people who have been raped, but they've never had, it's been very difficult for them to speak about it. So now, sitting in a small room, just me and another woman, with her recounting what happened in such graphic detail, I mean, it's just very difficult to, to humanize the Assad regime after hearing the experiences that they've been through, and the fact that this is a routine thing that the Assad regime does. The rape of women is, it's not just the rape of women, it's also the rape of men. The most inhumane and graphic torture happens in Assad prison. My own father was tortured in the Assad, by the Assad regime in prisons in the 80s, not recently. He had his back broken, he was made to walk on hot iron, he was put in a big wheel where his head essentially touched his toes, and then he was pushed down a very steep ladder. A lot of people die from that. My father happened to come out with a completely broken back, where he had to have multiple operations done on him, and he suffers till this day. He still has marks on his face from the torture, and that's just someone who was tortured for a few weeks. Imagine now the Syrians who've been in Assad's dungeons for the past 9 years. Inhumane torture.
And there's so many of them. It's not like it's just certain people, 1 or 2 families. These are, the numbers are so many. Can you
no, we don't know how many people have disappeared. We don't know how many people are in the Assad prisons. It's definitely over 20,000 since the Syrian Revolution started, and that's a very conservative estimate. And even then, sometimes we don't know who is still alive and who hasn't been killed. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of Caesar. Caesar was a forensic photographer who managed to flee, I think in 2014, 2015, perhaps 2015, and he released thousands and thousands of pictures and photographs of those who have been killed by the Assad regime. Many of those people, many of the families of those people had no idea that these people were dead. They ended up identifying them purely through Caesar's photos. And even then, through Caesar's photos, we were able to see the torture marks on them. Or if we even go back to a very well-known case like Hamza al-Khatib. Hamza al-Khatib was a 13-year-old boy from Dar'a. He was taken from a protest in May, I believe, or April 2011, so at the beginning of the Syrian Revolution. When the protest started off in Dar'a, he was taken, he was tortured, and then his body was delivered to his parents, and his entire body was deformed. He had cigarette burnt marks on him. He was deformed in the private areas. His entire body was, I don't know what the word is, but it was just scarred in the most grotesque way. And it was very well documented. It's very well documented. And the Assad regime ensured that they sent the body back to the parents as a lesson for everyone else.
These lessons are, you know, they and this is something that, despite this intense hold on the people, why does the regime need external assistance? So this is something that It's like they have such deep control over the people. They have the weapons. They have all of that, but yet we still see them reaching out to Russia, to Iran, and to other such associates or allies of theirs. So can you share with us, like, why is that need, like why is that assistance needed, and how has the involvement of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, um, what effect has that had on the conflict, and over the years?
So in 2014, was it 2013, 2014? It was one of those years. The revolution very almost won. It was just a regime against the Syrian rebels and the Syrian protesters. And the Syrian protesters and the rebels had regained most of Syria. The regime was pushed back entirely. Even the outskirts of Damascus were taken away from the regime. And the regime had depleted resources because it had pushed all it had. The regime's biggest weapon was essentially the fear of the people. And when that fear broke, so Syria was known as a kingdom of fear, because in the 70s and the 80s, al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, would massacre entire cities. The most well-known of them is Hama, where the conservative estimate is 40,000 people were killed in a space of 2 days. But the reality is that much more than that were killed. Between 80,000 and 60,000 people were killed. Over 25,000 people were detained. And disappeared in prisons, amongst of which my own uncle was detained, and he remained in prison for 17 years. Another uncle was killed in prison. So after this, the regime managed to really, it had a hold on the people because it scared them that should you say anything, should you attempt anything, this is what's going to happen to you. Hama is going to happen to you. Tadmur is going to happen to you. Tadmur was another massacre which happened inside one of the Assad regime's prisons. So this was the regime's biggest weapon. When that was shattered in March 2011, the regime didn't have much else to hold on to apart from its military power. And now every single day, its military power, it was repressing and attempting to repress protesters. It was out, it was fighting against its own defected people. So its own people who knew the military tactics, the Syrian regime's military tactics. By 2013, the regime's resources were almost completely depleted, and hence why they had to call in for reinforcements. They called in the help of Iran, via Iran Hezbollah, and in 2015, Russia also joined, Russia being a long-time ally of the Syrian regime. I mean, it goes without saying that the allies of the Syrian regime, once they joined the fight, it became much more brutal, and it became. I mean, the sides were no longer. They were never equal in the first place, but there was some sort of equality to an extent, in that it was Syrians fighting Syrians, and now it was Syria. There was the well-trained Iranian army, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. You had not just the Iranian army, but you also had Iranian proxy armies, and you had people, small sectarian militias who were brought in via Iran, and then you had the Russian Air Force, and that was the biggest devastation to the Syrian Revolution, to have the Russian Air Force come in. When we think back now, so with the Iranian regime and the help of Iran to Syria, we had a lot more massacres. We had a lot more sectarian massacres, and I think bringing Iran in really shifted some of the battles to very sectarian battles. And previously, we didn't have this problem in Syria. In December 2016, with the fall of Aleppo, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, they played a massive role in besieging Aleppo. What they did was they besieged the entirety, alongside the Syrian regime's the Syrian regime's army, the Syrian Arab Army. They besieged the entirety of eastern Aleppo. They didn't allow anyone out. they attempted to really starve the people, and anyone who left would be killed, or would be detained, or they would torture them in the way that they wanted. They were under the command of the now deceased Qasim Soleimani, who really devastated my mother's home city. When the evacuation started in December, there was a ceasefire. They reached a ceasefire. The opposition and the Assad regime and the allies, they reached a ceasefire. And when the evacuation of certain, especially the elderly, started out of Aleppo, out of eastern Aleppo into either western Aleppo or into Turkey, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, actually, they were the first to breach the ceasefire. They ended up seizing one of the convoys that had about, I don't know, but I think about 100 people inside. Ended up seizing that, and they detained the Syrian civil defense who were leading the convoy out, who were looking after the convoy, killing 3 of them and injuring the rest. I think the rest were 7 or 8 people. And ever since then, they've just waged war against war. I think even just about a few months ago, not months ago, a few weeks ago, we had an incident where certain militias, certain Iranian militias, ended up desecrating the grave of the 5th Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz in Idlib, which was completely unnecessary. But it's very obvious that they were doing something in order to elicit a war, or elicit some sort of, reaction from the people on ground. With regards to Russia, I mean, Russia's completely devastated entire cities with carpet bombings, with their airstrikes. That's where much of the regime's air power comes from, air force power comes from, and in a sense, they it's just made Syrians, like the Syrian opposition, really not be able to fight back. Because how do you fight back when you're on ground? How do you fight the military or the air force from the ground? So yeah, definitely it made everything much more violent. I can't hear him.
Yeah. So in all of this, what stories of the Syrian people do you find missing from mainstream media? What narratives? We talked a little bit about elderly and the fact that the refugees are they're not just the young men with the cell phones, who can trudge through the forests and reach Europe. So we talked about, but what else is missing? Whose voices are missing? Which narrative is missing currently in mainstream media?
I think it's very important to always bear in mind that Syrians are not a monolith. Obviously, there are Syrians who are anti-regime, there are Syrians who are pro-regime, and we can't take the agency away from them. Then there's varying degrees of opposition, varying degrees of people, and everyone has their own different experiences, even if the war in the country has a very unifying experience. That said, I think one thing that we forget to focus on a lot is that Syrians haven't been passive. I think, especially in recent years, especially after the fall of Aleppo, a lot of the narrative out there is that assumes that Syrians are for the most part passive, assumes that Syrians for the most part are helpless or can't help themselves. This would do an incredible injustice to the Syrians who've been rebuilding their country and rebuilding their own homes, rebuilding their towns and villages since the day that Assad began bombing them. So up until recently, I've been working with the Syrian Health Organization, or with various Syrian health organizations, and we have hospitals, we have primary healthcare centers. I remember when my first orientation week, and I went in and I had to learn everything because I was the head of communications, and so I would be the spokesperson for that organization should anyone get in touch. And I was learning about all the hospitals, where everything was, and I was learning all the medical terminology, and I was completely astounded. Despite being active on Syria for the past 9 years, even I was completely astounded by the number of hospitals we had. And I realized that this is something that is very absent from the narrative. People think that when we speak about hospitals, we're speaking about the hospitals that we know, in the UK, in Turkey, in America. These are makeshift hospitals. These are Syrian doctors who didn't know anything previously about erecting an entire hospital or entire primary healthcare clinic. They ended up going, they were scouted around amongst the rubble, amongst the destruction, found a safe place, found a relatively well, not so damaged place, house, or bigger center or old hospital, and turned it into an actually functioning hospital. And I'm not just speaking about the healthcare force. I'm not speaking about the healthcare workforce here. I'm speaking about Syrians all over. Syrians have been rebuilding their country from day one. And I think people need to realize that Syrians have always wanted a better and dignified life for themselves. And they've done that not just by protesting, not just by fighting, but also by being practically on ground. Whenever Assad would bomb something, they would go and they would rebuild it. My own aunt had her house bombed several times and she had to move. My aunt is elderly. She's well into her 60s. She was almost 70. She had, I think the last time her house was bombed was also in 2016. 2015, actually, 2015, her house was bombed. And it was bombed not just by a normal bomb, it was also, it contained poisonous gas. She could have almost died, but because Syrians on ground train the elderly and train other Syrians on survival tactics, she had remembered, because she'd listened to the radio once, and she heard, like, she knew what to do in that position, so she ended up covering her face with a wet towel until the Syrian White Helmets, the Syrian Civil Defense, came over and took her out. Within a month, her flat was rebuilt, and it wasn't rebuilt by the regime. It wasn't rebuilt by any state. It was rebuilt by Syrians. They weren't being paid for it necessarily. They just knew that, okay, the regime are going to keep bombing us. We have to keep rebuilding. We can't just live amongst this devastation. I think this is something that we, without realizing, we dehumanize Syrians themselves. Even when we intend well, we dehumanize, we see them as victims, we see them as refugees, and they are. And many of them are, and many of them are living in really, like, incredibly bad conditions. I spoke previously about those who don't even have shelter, who are currently on the border. There are others, not just in Syria, in Lebanon, even people underneath, beneath people under Syrian regime control. But at the same time, there are also a lot of Syrians who have been working actively on building a dignified life for themselves. And I feel like we need to highlight that in order for people to be aware that a revolution isn't just protest and, okay, we're done. It's not a war that, okay, that you win with force. It's a war that you win with narratives, that you win with mentality. And so long as the Syrians keep going out and they keep rebuilding their own lives for themselves and keep resisting the regime by literally rebuilding their own lives, the revolution will keep going on.
Oh, that is so important to hear that, because those are you don't hear that. You don't hear the strength of the people who have been surviving this for 9 years, and assisting their own people with whatever resources they have, and that is, and that's the beauty of. And that gives strength to other revolutions around the world as well, when you share those narratives. And that's why some of these narratives are squashed. And that brings me to another question, which is really it's confused a lot of activists here in the United States as well, that there are certain actors in this narrative, right? There are people that were really, journalists and citizen journalists who were really good on issues like Palestine and, uplifting those voices, really well known, books are published, we all followed their columns, and now suddenly they have become, sort of pariahs in the circles of people who are concerned about the people of Syria, because they're seen as spokespeople for Assad's regime. So, can you tell us what happened there? Who is being used and how they're being used, so people can sort of get a clearer idea of what people who are closely associated to the revolution think about this?
So I'm not sure what happened with those people in particular. I mean, it also was very sad for those of us who saw them initially at the beginning as voices of justice, and particularly saying how they really helped the Palestinian struggle. Um, my personal take on this is that much of these people have more loyalty to an ideology than they do to justice itself. Because should you have loyalty to justice, you won't be swayed by mere ideologies. You won't be swayed by this facade that you believe that anti-imperialism exists amongst the Assad regime, without actually contextualizing the Assad regime and realizing that they are very not anti-imperialists, particularly with the help that they seek from Russia, and particularly with their history, even the extraordinary rendition program. All you have to do is look back and see that the Assad regime have always worked alongside America, even if they pretended or put on a pretense and hid behind this veneer that they happen to be anti-imperial. It's very important for us, I think, as Muslims, or just generally as human beings, to be critical, to ensure that we don't allow ideologies to cloud our judgments. I think this is what's happened to these people, and perhaps over the years, it's got to their egos. I'm not actually entirely sure what's happened. I mean, I used to follow certain people like Rania, like Max, like Ben Norton. They have really stooped very low to the point that they mock actual Syrians, such as my aunt, such as my own cousins who've been killed in this struggle, without actually understanding or even allowing themselves to have an objective take or an objective look. I think even one of them recently, in the last few years, traveled to Syria, but they only stayed in regime-held areas, and they ensured that they had a regime chaperone with them at all times, which isn't at all what objectivity means. It's very important, I think, for anyone, not just when it comes to Syria, when it comes to any struggle, to always listen to the people on ground. Because if you think about it, when you listen to people who aren't on ground, people who don't come from these places, it's just another form of colonization, imperialism, isn't it? You're allowing the voices of non-natives to take precedence over the voices of actual natives. And that's very problematic. We're seeing it currently now in the US. So I would just, like, my only piece of advice is to always search for the native voices, search for those who are focused on Syria also. I think there are a lot of people who, because they're committed to a certain ideology, they happen to have takes on lots of things, but then when you actually come down to it, it's a very ideological stance, you know? People, you can't be an expert on Syria, on Libya, on Palestine, on Black Lives Matter, on everything all at once. I don't think that's very honest. I think if you truly do care about what's happening in Syria, go and follow the works of someone who's been working constantly on Syria. Follow the works and the voices of those who are on ground, and make your own mind up, essentially, but ensure that you listen. And ensure that you take what they say into consideration. And I mean, we live in an era where you can easily fact check things. I mean, we have OSINT, we have even like Google, you can very easily fact check things. So just, use what you have, use the tools that you have, and ensure that you're not doing injustice to people who have already had injustice done to them for the past 50 years.
We're close to the hour. I really wanted to ask you, because this is a lot of a focus of your work as well, what, under this pandemic, how has COVID affected the refugee population and the population inside Syria? What should humanitarian organizations, as well as human rights organizations, be focused on? So if you'd like to end this discussion with that.
Sure. So in Syria, we have a politicized health system. We have sort of like 3 health systems which are working parallel to each other but don't work with each other. So we have the regime's health system, then we have the health system in Northwest Syria, which is under primarily the Idlib Directorate of Health. Then we have the one in Northeastern Syria. In fact, you could say 4, which on one hand, under the Kurdish control, is under Kurdish control, and then the parts which are under Turkish control correspond back to Turkey. In, I think, the regime-held areas, in the regime-held areas, I think we've had 58 confirmed cases, I believe, but most experts and analysts believe that that's a very conservative figure and believe that the regime haven't actually been honest with the number of Islamabad, I forgot what that is in English, but the number of cases, essentially. In Northwest Syria, we haven't had any reported cases. In Northeast Syria, we've had, I think, 6 reported cases, 4 of which have recovered, 1 of which has died. I believe the 5th, we don't have an update on that yet. So Northwest Syria is what I'm most interested in, because it's the area which has been neglected the most by WHO, by anyone and everyone, essentially, because it is the non-regime held area. It's under the control of, part of it is under control of HTS, other parts under control of rebel groups. The health sector operates completely independently of whoever's in charge, essentially. On one hand, it's been great that no one currently has coronavirus, at least no one that we know of. There has been no reported cases. On the other hand, it's very important to speak about the healthcare system there. So, as I said previously, when you asked me about what I wanted people to know, and I spoke about Syrians and Syrians rebuilding, Syrians retaking agency. So what we've had is we've actually had Syrians attempting to prepare and attempting to be very prepared for COVID-19. So since the beginning, since March, we've had at least, so I think actually, in fact, the latest number since from March until May, we've had 104 hospitals which have established triage systems. We have had 2 isolation centers that have been set up. We have, I think, 4 ICUs which have been set up. And we have 98 ventilators which are ready to work. Now, bearing in mind the numbers I just said, we're speaking about a population of 4.17 million. People who are living in camps, people who are completely disorganized, people who prior to the pandemic have been living in terrible, terrible conditions. So we haven't actually, or they haven't actually been able to implement the physical distancing, the sanitation, the hygiene that other countries around the world have been able to implement. And even then, again, we're speaking about people who are living, their shelter is tents. So there's nothing really protecting them should COVID-19 enter the sphere. It would be complete devastation. It would be catastrophic. We've been lucky so far that this hasn't been the case, and I guess to an extent, thanks to the war, this hasn't been the case because no one travels in and out of the area unless they're delivering equipment, medical equipment, or food via the Turkish border. That said, there's a constant scare that should something happen, this would be completely catastrophic. We might see complete might see complete families just being wiped out. And we're not just speaking about Syrians who are currently living in camps. We're also speaking about Syrians who currently are detained, are in prisons in the Assad regime, in the Assad regime dungeons, and in the Assad regime prisons. Prisons are often overcrowded. They're very poorly ventilated. People live in complete unhygienic conditions, and we don't even have time to speak about the torture. So imagine someone who's tortured, and people are constantly being tortured in Assad prisons. And there's sparse hygiene, and malnutrition is rife in Assad prisons. So should anyone contract COVID-19 in Assad's prisons, that would be a death sentence to so many people, to so many prisoners who are living very closely together. So we hope for the best. I think currently, despite Syrians being, especially Syrians living in non-regime held areas, despite them being most vulnerable, despite WHO to an extent actually neglecting them, because WHO tends to work primarily with state actors and not so much with non-state actors. So far we've been lucky, but this is still a ticking time bomb, and we just hope for the best.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Razan, and sharing your family's story, your work, and really in uplifting the voices a lot of times that we don't hear, the stories that we don't hear. And that's one of the goals is, as alternative media, that we can relay those narratives to the folks who are listening, and remind people not to forget about the people in Syria, the ones who are living under the regime, who have been suffering, and also who have been rebuilding, who are continuing to revolt by positively rebuilding their cities, their towns, their homes, and surviving despite being brutalized in many, many ways. So thank you so much for joining us, all of you, and keep watching. Assalamu alaikum.